Boring history for sleep, how medieval peasants survived brutal winters. Hey there, tonight we're heading back, not to warm castles or candlelit feasts, but to smoke-filled huts and frozen earth. This is winter in the Middle Ages, the real one. No glory, no armor, just peasants doing their best to survive months of cold, hunger, and silence. Snow drifted through the roof, bread turned to stone, wolves came closer, and every day you got up and did it all again. If slow, grounded history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what brings you comfort. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Wrap yourself in something warm, and let's begin. In a season that didn't just test people, it tried to end them. You don't need a calendar to know when winter's coming. You feel it in the bones first. They stiffen like yesterday's bread. Then in the sky, which goes from blue to a kind of reluctant gray. And finally in the animals, who start looking at you with quiet suspicion, as if they know something you don't. And they usually do. Autumn doesn't end. It retreats slowly. Leaves fall, sure, but it's not just that. It's the way the wind changes direction. It starts slipping through the gaps in the cottage, exploring the place like an uninvited guest, poking around, finding where the warmth lives and evicting it. The chickens grow quieter. The dog stops barking at the wind and begins listening to it instead. That's how you know it's nearly time. The sun, when it shows up at all, feels thin, as if it's forgotten how to be warm. And everyone walks just a bit faster, not because they're in a hurry, but because standing still hurts more. There's no grand announcement, no snowstorm with a flourish. Winter arrives like debt, quietly and with a great deal of consequence. The first task always is denial. You pretend the cold is temporary, a chill, nothing more. You wear the same tunic you wore in October, but now with a cloak that's more whole than fabric. You tell yourself you'll mend it. You won't, not because you're lazy, but because the needle's bent, the threads run out, and your fingers are too numb to hold either. We talk a lot about preparation, as if we were always ready. But let's be honest, most winters arrive when we're not quite finished with autumn. There's always a corner of the roof you meant to fix, or would you meant to chop. Always something still left in the garden that didn't get dried or salted or stored in time. Still, you do what you can. You stuff straw between the gaps in the wall. You drape cloth over the doorway. You rearrange the beds so everyone sleeps a little closer to the hearth. Even Uncle Gain, who smells like sheep and talks in his sleep about debts no one remembers. You don't light fires all day. That's a luxury. Wood is for evenings, for cooking, and for the hour or so when everyone pretends to be cheerful. The rest of the time, you rely on movement, layering, and the heat of several reluctant siblings pressed together under one scratchy blanket. The animals sense it too. They linger longer near the shelter. The chickens huddle. The pigs go quiet, which is deeply unsettling. The cows grow more irritable, which is to say they remain exactly the same. Outside, the ground turns to iron. The paths that were muddy last week are now treacherous half-frozen ruts that twist ankles and swallow boots. Water in the bucket develops a skin of ice. You break it each morning with a ladle, then curse softly as it numbs your hands. And the sky just hangs there low, gray, expectant, like it's waiting for something. You squint at it as if you might read it, as if clouds carry messages. They don't, but they do mean you won't see the sun again for several weeks. In town, people walk faster, they speak in shorter sentences. Jokes dry up. No one's really in the mood. Even the church sermons get a little darker. The priest reminds you that cold weather is God's way of encouraging humility. You wonder if God might try a slightly warmer lesson plan. And then, finally, one morning it happens. Snow. Not a blizzard. Not yet. Just a dusting, like flour spilled across the fields. But it changes everything. The thatch turns white. The trees stiffen. Your breath comes out in little clouds. And every step outside sounds like you're stepping on old parchment. And with that snow comes the realization. You're locked in now. The earth has closed up shop for the season. No more digging. No more planting. Nothing will grow. What you've already stored is all you've got. And if you didn't store enough, well, You'll learn how thin stew can really get. You begin to count things differently. Not in days, but in bundles. How many bundles of firewood left? How many sacks of grain? How many turnips? How many eggs this week? Not many, as the hens stop laying when it's cold. They prefer to huddle near the fire, just like everyone else. You keep yourself busy, even if nothing feels productive. You mend clothes, you scrape pans, you stir ashes hoping a warm coal is hiding underneath. If there's time, and there often is, you spin wool. It's not just for making cloth. It's for keeping your hands moving, your mind occupied. Too much quiet, and your thoughts start getting ideas. The animals aren't just company, they're cohabitants. The warmer ones are invited inside. Not all at once. There are boundaries after all, but enough to turn the house into a communal stew of smells, sounds, and shared body heat. You get used to waking up with a goat breathing on your neck. Well, maybe not used to, but you stop fighting it. Evenings are the worst. The sun disappears too early, and the darkness arrives like it's angry about something. Candles are expensive. Tallow lamps are smoky. You sit near the fire, if there's one going, and you listen to stories, to wind, to the way the wood pops when it burns. Sometimes someone gets it in their head to tell a ghost story. This always seems like a good idea until you realize you have to walk across the freezing yard to use the privy afterward. You run. You try not to trip. You definitely don't look into the shadows. And yet, winter isn't all misery. There's a rhythm to it, a kind of bitter predictability. You know the chores, you know the limits, and there's a strange camaraderie in knowing everyone else is miserable too. You learn to find comfort in small victories. Warm feet for 5 minutes, a stew that tastes slightly less like despair, a day without wind cutting through the cracks in the wall. You celebrate quietly, because the moment you laugh too loud, someone will remind you, we've only just begun. Historically, we peasants didn't fare too well in winters. The Little Ice Age, starting around the 14th century, brought harsher, longer winters across Europe. Rivers froze, crops failed. In some years, the Rhine froze solid for months, and markets were held right on the ice. Yes, people shopped on frozen rivers, until the ice decided otherwise. In particularly bad years, like 1315 to 1317, rain ruined crops for seasons. It wasn't just cold, it was famine. Up to 30 million people affected. And when there's no food, people get imaginative. Cannibalism was whispered about, infanticide too. Not dinner table conversation, but then again, we didn't always have dinner. But that's the thing about winter. It's not just about enduring the cold, it's about enduring each other. A family of 6, 3 goats, 2 chickens, and a bucket of salted fish sharing 20 square feet of living space. That's a social experiment with no exit. You hear every cough, every complaint, every unfortunate digestive development. Privacy becomes a myth. Modesty goes out with the sunlight. You do your best not to argue, not out of patience, but because it stirs up the air and lets him more cold. And so you settle in. You shrink your world down to a few feet around the fire. You learn the weight of every blanket, the creak of every board, the rhythm of the weather. Days shorten, nights lengthen, and time starts to dissolve into a sort of frozen soup. You're not living, exactly, you're enduring. And eventually, you stop asking how long winter will last. You just wake up each day and survive that one. If you're lucky, the firewood holds out. If you're very lucky, the roof does too. Because in a medieval winter, the cold doesn't knock. It lets itself in and stays a while. And tomorrow it starts again. Winter doesn't just try to kill you with cold. It kills you with chores. And at the top of that frozen to-do list, wood. Endless amounts of it. You don't just need a few logs for ambience. You need firewood like your life depends on it, because it does. Everything revolves around fire. It cooks your food, warms your bones, dries your socks, scares off rats, and makes the house only mostly uninhabitable. Without it, you're not a peasant. You're a popsicle with taxes. But fire doesn't magically appear. It takes wood, lots of it, cut, carried, chopped, stacked, and cursed out. Gathering firewood is the medieval equivalent of having a second full-time job, except this one pays in back pain and frostbite. There's no chainsaw, no gas-powered anything. Just an axe that's been in the family, so long you're not sure if it's a tool or an heirloom. The handle's cracked, the blade is blunt, but it's still better than using your hands, which, let's face it, you probably will anyway once the axe gets stuck in the third log. You start in autumn, of course. Everyone says that. Start early. Except there's never enough time. The harvest runs late. Your neighbor borrowed your axe, and you sprained your ankle trying to outrun an angry goose. So here you are in December, swinging steel at a tree like it insulted your mother, praying it falls in the right direction. And trees don't cooperate. They're heavy, unpredictable, and covered in snow. You cut one down, only to realize you still have to chop it, carry it, and stack it. Repeat 50 times. If you're lucky, your back just hurts. If you're not, the tree lands on you, and you become a cautionary tale. Once the wood is chopped, it needs to dry. That takes months, so you burn it wet, which means it smokes, hisses, and barely burns at all. Congratulations. You've just turned your home into a tepid, smoky nightmare. Hope you weren't planning to breathe properly this winter. The rich, of course, have options. They hire people. They send servants into the woods while they sip wine in front of a roaring hearth. You are the servant, and your hearth is mostly a pile of wet twigs trying their best. Legally, you're not even allowed to gather wood in some places. Forests belong to lords, and if you're caught collecting kindling on noble land, the punishment ranges from fines to beatings too, occasionally, being made an example of for picking up sticks. Yes, really. That's why many peasants turn to alternatives, things like peat, dried animal dung, or bundles of brush. These technically burn, in the same way that technically soup counts as a meal. Peat gives off heat, but also a smell like wet ashes and regret. Dung burns surprisingly well, but let's not pretend anyone's happy about it. Still, you use what you have. You gather dried cow patties with frozen hands and pretend you're not inhaling memories of last summer's pasture. The good news, it's free. The bad news, your cottage now smells like a campfire held inside a barn. Stacking firewood is an art. Too tight, and it molds. Too loose, and it falls over and breaks your toe. So you build a neat pile against the wall of your house, wrap it with whatever canvas you can steal from your cousin, and hope it doesn't collapse under snow. It will. And you never have enough. That's the golden rule. Doesn't matter how much wood you cut, it's never enough. By February, you're down to burning fence posts, old furniture, or anything that vaguely resembles timber. There's no sentimentality. If it catches fire, it's fuel. You dream of firewood. You count logs instead of sheep. You have actual arguments over who burned the good stick too early. You ration embers. You hoard coals like they're treasure. And if you manage to find a particularly dry branch under the snow, you bring it home, like a war trophy. Sleeping in winter is a gamble. If the fire dies out, the temperature inside drops to hope you rotowill. You tuck in close under layers of blankets, furs, and other humans, not because you like them, but because survival beats personal space. In some homes, livestock sleep inside too, not out of kindness, out of necessity. Chickens provide eggs and ambient warmth. Pigs are radiators with hooves. Cows are basically space heaters that moo. It's not cozy. It's crowded and noisy, and smells like a petting zoo collapsed into a soup kitchen, but it's marginally better than freezing to death. Historically, peasants didn't just rely on personal effort. Communities often worked together to chop and haul wood. It was less about bonding and more about shared suffering. Everyone had blisters, everyone was freezing, everyone was equally miserable, which made it slightly easier to endure. In some regions, people used wood-saving tricks. Clay ovens were shared, communal fires were maintained all day. You'd take turns baking bread in the village oven, all while pretending not to notice how warm Agnes's house always seemed to be. Suspiciously warm, in fact. Women and children gathered kindling, not because it was easier, but because that's just how the labor got divided. If you were small and had fingers, you were sent to the woods with a basket and told not to come back empty. What you returned with might have been twigs, might have been pine cones. Either way, you contributed. And then there's chopping itself, a deeply medieval kind of misery. Your gloves, if you have them, are soaked through in minutes. Your fingers go numb. The axe slips. The wood splits wrong. Something hits your shin. You yell, not because it helps, but because that's all you've got left. By midwinter, the ground's too hard to chop into. Your hands have more splinters than skin, and you still haven't figured out where half your wood pile disappeared to. Spoiler, your neighbor borrowed it again. And yet, you keep going, because fire is non-negotiable. It's warmth, it's food. It's the difference between making it to spring or becoming the reason your cottage smells even worse. When you sit by the fire at night, tired, sore, and lightly smoked, you feel something like peace. Not comfort, just the absence of immediate doom, which in the Middle Ages is as close as you're going to get. Of course, some winters are worse than others. You remember the bad ones by name. The winter of '43 when the roof collapsed, or the long freeze when the river turned to stone and everyone tried ice skating in wooden shoes. Some didn't make it. A few froze. A few just left and never came back. You stop asking questions after a while. The firewood dwindles. The wind whistles. You find yourself eyeing furniture a little differently. That stool you never liked suddenly looks flammable. Sentiment gives way to survival. If it burns, it's valuable. Eventually, the thaw comes. The snow retreats like a tired thief. The mud returns. Your boots vanish somewhere in it. But you made it. You survived another medieval winter without running out of wood, without freezing to death, and without strangling your cousin for stealing your best log. That's the victory. No medals, no parade, just frostbitten fingers, permanent smoke smell, and the deeply satisfying knowledge that you're not a popsicle. Not this year, anyway. And the next morning, you do it all over again, because even as spring edges closer, the cold lingers, the chores never stop, and the fire, that fickle, flickering little god, always wants more. More wood, more sweat, more of you. And you give it, because in the end, it's not about comfort, it's about survival, one splinter at a time. And tomorrow, same routine. Chop, stack, burn, freeze, repeat. You don't beat winter, you survive it. And if you're lucky, next year's axe won't break before your spirit does. Because in the end, winter doesn't care how tired you are. The logs won't chop themselves, the fire won't feed itself, and warmth, that rare, fleeting thing, has to be earned every single day. You don't need a calendar to know it's winter. Your stomach tells you first, loudly, repeatedly. It's not hunger in the modern sense, that gentle rumble that reminds you to check the fridge. It's deeper, angrier, the kind of emptiness that makes you stare at bark and wonder, could I stew that? Food in a medieval winter is like firewood, always running out, never easy to get, and guaranteed to cause arguments. You don't plan meals, you ration them. You stretch them. You look at 3 shriveled turnips and call it a feast. You start with what you've stored: grains, mostly. Barley, rye, oats, wheat if you're rich or stealing from someone who is. You keep them in sacks, barrels, or anything that keeps out rats, which is nothing. The rats always find a way. They're like furry tax collectors with teeth. Most of your meals revolve around pottage, the medieval mystery stew. It's not so much a recipe as a lifelong experiment. You throw in whatever's edible and hope it doesn't kill you. Root vegetables, dried beans, wilted greens, maybe a strip of dried pork if you've got royal connections or a generous neighbor. It simmers for days, sometimes weeks. New ingredients are just added to the pot. Old ones never quite leave. It tastes like boiled earth with a hint of onion and regret. You eat it anyway, every day. Twice a day if you're lucky. Not because you like it, but because it's there. And in winter, that's enough. Meat is rare. You don't have a freezer. You don't even have a cold cellar, just a slightly less awful corner of the cottage. If you did slaughter something in the fall, a pig, a goat, your neighbor's least favorite chicken, you salt it, smoke it, dry it, and then hide it from everyone in the house, especially the kids. Kids will eat anything, including raw bacon and the string you tied it with. Sometimes you fish, if the river isn't frozen, if the ice isn't too thick, and if you haven't already burned your fishing rod for kindling. Ice fishing is a thing, just not a fun thing. You chip away at a hole in the ice while your toes slowly lose sensation. Then you sit, wait, and contemplate how life became a series of increasingly stupid decisions. If you're near the sea, you might dry some herring or smoke eel. It's nutritious, it's long-lasting, and it tastes exactly how it sounds. If you're not near water, You rely on whatever your neighbors didn't guard well enough. Bread is essential, but it's also a gamble. Made from whatever flour you've got, rye, barley, sometimes lentils, and often padded out with filler. Sawdust, yes. Ground acorns, maybe. Bark on a bad year. Bread isn't soft and fluffy. It's a blunt object, something between food and medieval defense weapon. And sometimes the bread fights back. In damp storage, rye can grow a fungus called ergot, a delightful little microbe that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and occasionally death. You don't know this. All you know is that the bread makes you see colors, scream at clouds, and possibly become a religious visionary or a witch, depending on who's watching. Dairy helps. If you have animals that have it frozen, wandered off, or been eaten. Milk spoils quickly, so you turn it into butter or cheese. The cheese is hard, salty, and vaguely threatening. Butter is a luxury. You keep it wrapped in cloth, hidden under your bed, like it's gold, because in winter it basically is. Eggs. Not likely. Chickens slow down in the cold. They're too busy trying not to die. You might get one a week, maybe two if you speak nicely to the hens and threaten the rooster. That egg goes in the pottage, or you stare at it long enough to get full from imagination. Fresh fruits and vegetables. That's adorable. No apples, no greens, maybe a dried plum from last August if it didn't rot or become home to a worm. Most vitamin C comes from sour cabbage or fermented turnip, lovingly described as crunchy disappointment in vinegar. It keeps scurvy away, but also friends. Preservation is everything. You salt, smoke, pickle, and dry anything that once moved, grew, or was near something that did. You make jams from berries, if you managed to find them and didn't eat them all in the sugar-starved frenzy last summer. You hang herbs from the ceiling until they drop into the soup, one by one, like leafy confetti. Nothing is wasted. Bones are boiled twice. The fat is saved. Even the ashes from the fire end up in soap or used to scrub pots. If someone throws away food, you question their sanity. Or you marry them, because clearly they're wealthy enough to waste things. And then there's hunger itself. Not mild hunger, not I skip lunch hunger, but the kind that makes you feel your stomach rubbing against your spine, the kind that makes you chew slowly, not for flavor, but to make it last. Hunger's a full-time presence in winter. It sits with you, watches you cook, comments on your portions, judges your neighbor's squirrel stew and says, "Actually, that looks all right." There's a rhythm to it. You wake up hungry. You go to bed still hungry. You learn to live with the gnawing feeling, like a mouse chewing inside your belly. Eventually, you stop noticing, until you smell stew from a neighbor's hut and immediately consider selling a sibling. Even the better-off peasants don't eat well. They just eat slightly more of the same bland, mealy disappointment. Occasionally, someone manages a real treat. Honeycomb, fresh apple slices, a slice of salted beef the size of a coin. It's a celebration, not for the flavor, but for the reminder that life isn't always awful. And then come the lean years, the bad harvests, the crop failures. You remember the winter of 1316, or at least the stories. Heavy rains drowned the fields, rot set in, grain yields collapsed, livestock starved. Entire villages went hungry. They call it the Great Famine, not for dramatic flair, but because it really was that bad. Some people ate roots, some ate moss, some, well, let's just say medieval cookbooks don't list stewed shoe leather for nothing. Monks kept records, bless them. They wrote about entire families vanishing, about parents choosing which child got the last crust, about people found dead in snowdrifts clutching turnips like treasure. It's not folklore, it's the forgotten footnotes of history. And when you do find food, the fire's gone out. So you eat cold stew by candlelight, huddled under a fur that still smells like the animal it came from. And you're grateful, because at least it's food. At least you get to chew something that isn't your own lip. Meals are short, the hunger is long. You scrape your bowl clean, not out of manners, but because you need every crumb. You lick your fingers, you scrape the pot. You consider eating the pot. Then remember it's your only one. Your body changes. You move slower. You lose weight. You don't call it dieting. You call it still alive. And yet, you keep going, because hunger is a fact, not a crisis. You don't expect to feel full. You just hope not to feel worse. That's winter, Not a battle, but a negotiation between you, your pantry, and the number of meals until April. There's no holiday feast, unless you're lucky or well-connected. Maybe you save a sausage for Christmas. Maybe a neighbor shares a pie made with mystery meat and courage. You don't ask questions, you eat, you smile. And you try not to cry when it's gone in 3 bites. Even the celebration foods are practical. Spiced ale, if you can afford spices. Nut cakes, if anyone had nuts. Pies filled with dried fruits, soaked in syrup and desperation. They're more ritual than indulgence, a way to remind yourself that joy exists, even if it's crusted in soot and shared with a dozen shivering relatives. So what did you eat in a medieval winter? Anything that wouldn't eat you first. Anything you could preserve, hide, or boil until it stopped arguing. You didn't dine, you survived. Because in the end, hunger wears a wool coat. It wraps around you. It stays close. It whispers in your ear. And when spring finally arrives, the first green shoot you see, you don't admire it. You bite it. Your home in the Middle Ages is not a refuge. It is not a sanctuary. It is not, by any modern standard, a building. It's more like a wooden suggestion of shelter, loosely stapled to a dirt floor and held together by good intentions, dried mud, and the unspoken agreement that nobody sneezes too hard. Let's start with the walls. Wattle and daub, if you're lucky. That's woven wooden strips covered in mud, straw, and whatever else was lying around. Cow dung, hair gossip. You pack it all together and pray it hardens before the next storm hits. Spoiler, it doesn't. On a good day, the wind whistles through the cracks. On a bad day, the wind howls through like it owns the place and wants rent. There's no insulation, there's no sealant. There's just the outside, and slightly less outside. Your roof is thatched, of course, which sounds quaint until you realize it's just dried plant matter arranged in a vaguely triangular shape. It leaks constantly. Rain comes in, snow piles up, birds nest in it. Mice move in and start charging rent. If you're lucky, it only partially collapses during a storm. If you're not, you wake up with your ceiling in your lap and a chicken on your face. The floor dirt, just dirt. If it's muddy, you wait. If it's frozen, you slip. If it's dry, it turns to dust and gets into everything. Your lungs, your eyes, your soup. You try throwing down straw to soften it, which lasts approximately 6 hours before turning into a trampled, moldy paste that somehow smells like feet and despair. Windows. Don't be silly. Glass is for churches and rich people. You have holes. If you're feeling fancy, maybe you stretch some oiled parchment over the opening. It lets in light, and also every draft between now and Easter. Curtains? No. Cloth is too valuable to waste on luxuries like privacy. Doors barely latch. Hinges groan like wounded animals. You can barricade it with a log. Or if you're short on logs because you've already burned them for heat, maybe just hope the wind isn't in a mischievous mood. Fireplaces are central, but not in a cozy way. There's a fire pit in the middle of the room, no chimney, just a hole in the roof. So the smoke rises slowly, filling your home with a lovely gray fog that coats your walls, your lungs, and any hope you had of clear breathing until spring. You don't smell the smoke after a while. You are the smoke. Now let's talk furniture. You don't have much. A wooden bench, maybe a stool, a table if you're living the high life. Beds are shared with your spouse, your children, and occasionally livestock. The mattress is straw stuffed into a sack, which sounds fine until you remember that straw doesn't stay fluffy. It compresses, molds, and invites bugs. Your pillow is another sack. If you're lucky, it's full of feathers. If you're not, it's just more straw, possibly slightly less crunchy. Blankets. Wool if you've got it, or furs if something nearby died recently. Most nights, you sleep in your clothes under everything you own, hoping body heat plus faith equals survival. And if your fire dies out overnight, you wake up frozen in your own breath cloud, questioning every decision that led to this point. Heating the place is a challenge. You keep the fire going, sure, but heat rises, smoke rises, and unfortunately, you're sleeping on the floor, which means your toes freeze, while your rafters get a lovely sound experience. Stones around the hearth help. They absorb heat and release it slowly, but only if you have enough fuel to make them warm in the first place. You seal up cracks with moss, cloth, or mud. It doesn't work. The wind finds a way. It always finds a way. There are days when you swear the air inside is colder than the air outside, and you do something about it. But your fingers are too numb to untie your cloak. Lighting is another delight. You've got tallow candles, which drip, sputter, and reek of beef fat, or rush lights. Reeds dipped in animal grease, which burn like someone tried to weaponize a salad. The smoke from these mingles with the hearth smoke until the whole room is a low-hanging haze of medieval asthma triggers. And let's not forget the noise. Thin walls mean you hear everything. The wind, the livestock, your neighbor sneezing, your own stomach growling back at you like it's filing a complaint. Privacy, a myth. Solitude, only if you walk into the forest and don't come back. Of course, it's not just people living here. Your cottage shares space with animals. Chickens nest in corners. A goat sleeps under the table. If you've got a cow, she lives in the lean-to attached to the wall, unless it's too cold, in which case she joins you in the main room. There is no such thing as indoor and outdoor. There's only not dead from the cold. This makes the house warmer, slightly. It also makes it louder, messier, and smell like a barn that recently lost a bet. You sweep the floors, but the dirt just rearranges itself. The straw bedding smells like old milk, and if a chicken decides to lay an egg next to your head in the middle of the night, you say thank you and try to fall back asleep before it poops on your blanket. Your roof also houses guests, birds, rats, insects. The thatch is thick enough for nesting, which means come spring, you'll hear the pitter-patter of tiny feet above you at all hours. Sometimes they fall in. It's normal. You scream. The rat screams, and then you both pretend it never happened. Maintenance, constant. Door frames crack, rafters bend, doors sag, the wind tears the roof. You fix what you can with what you have, which is string, hope, and a very dull knife. You can't afford nails. You wedge things into place. You hammer wood together using a rock and a prayer, and if it's raining and the roof's leaking, you don't grab a bucket. You grab all the buckets. You position them around the house, like you're trying to win a very sad game of splash chess. You learn which spots drip first. You name them. You curse them. You learn to sleep around them. It's not all doom. There are warm moments. The fire catches well. Someone shares a fur. A draft stops for no reason. You convince yourself it's your craftsmanship. You huddle close with your family and pretend the smell is comforting. It's not, but it is familiar. Still, you endure it, because this isn't just a pile of timber and bad smells. It's home. It's where you were born, where your children were born, and where someone probably died last week. You patch it. You sweep it. You whisper to it in winter like it's a sick relative. Just hold on a little longer. You don't compare it to a castle. You compare it to not freezing to death. And by that measure, it's doing fine. Some wealthier peasants whitewash the walls, not for luxury, for lice. The lime kills bugs. A fresh coat every year keeps the walls bright, and the infestations mostly cosmetic. You think about doing it. You even collect the lime, but then the firewood runs out again. You hang herbs to make the air smell nicer. They dry out, crumble, fall into your soup. You eat them anyway. The taste is weird, but you tell yourself it's seasoning. It's not. And every so often, you dream of a second room, of a wooden floor, of a roof that doesn't make you flinch every time a breeze picks up. You don't expect it. You just let the thought sit with you while you stitch another patch into the wall and listen to the rain come through the ceiling. Because in the end, your house isn't warm or dry or peaceful, but it's still standing. And in a medieval winter, that's about as close to luxury as you're ever going to get. It's dawn, or close enough. There's a faint light outside that might be the sun, or just the moon giving up. Either way, it's time to get up. Not because you're rested. You're not. Not because you're excited. You're definitely not. But because your life depends on getting things done before frostbite, famine, or your neighbor's goat beats you to the water source. There's no weekend. There's no me time. There's barely enough time to scrape the frost off your eyebrows. Every day is a repeat of the last. Gather, mend, feed, carry, boil, patch, repeat. Winter in medieval Europe is a season-long to-do list written in mud, smoke, and fatigue. First job, get the fire going. You hope the embers survived the night. If not, you're back to flint and steel, hunched over kindling with frozen fingers and breath so visible it could be mistaken for a ghost. Wood is precious. You use it sparingly. A good fire means warmth, food, light, and life. A bad one means all of the above slowly slip away while you pretend you're not crying from smoke. Once the fire's going, or at least coughing along like an asthmatic squirrel, it's time for water. The bucket is heavy, the stream is half frozen, and the path is icy enough to host the worst Olympics event in history. Peasant figure skating. You fall, you spill. You curse the ice, the bucket, and the cruel joke that is winter. Then you do it again, because water doesn't fetch itself. Back home, you boil it, not because you're a health nut, but because it might kill you otherwise. Every sip is a gamble. Boiling water is also how you warm your hands, steam the hut, and delay feeling like a medieval failure for 10 more minutes. Next, animals. They need feeding before you do. Chickens are annoyed. Pigs are loud. The cow is judging you. You scrape together old hay, kitchen scraps, and whatever hasn't frozen solid. You check the coop for eggs. There aren't any again. The rooster, however, has plenty of opinions. If it snowed overnight, you clear the path to the door, not because it's tidy, but because falling into a snowdrift while holding a bucket of pig slop is the kind of memory that sticks. You shovel with a flat plank, your hands wrapped in rags, and mutter things that will get you excommunicated if anyone heard. With the animals fed and your fingers halfway thawed, it's time for breakfast, if you can call it that. Yesterday's pottage, reheated with today's regrets. Maybe some crusty bread, maybe not. If someone remembered to scrape the pot clean last night, you're scraping the scrapings. No one complains. Complaining takes energy. Then it's time for the real work. If you're a man, it's chores in the fields, forest, or forge. If you're a woman, it's everything else. Spinning wool, mending clothes, making food, cleaning soot, hauling water, stirring the pot, and somehow keeping 6 children alive while pretending your hands aren't frozen into claw shapes. Repairing the roof? That's your job. Fetching firewood? Also your job. Making sure the goat doesn't freeze, escape, or explode? Still your job. There are no task lists, just a rolling stream of crises that need solving before nightfall. Laundry is once a week, and it's its own form of purgatory. You drag clothes to the river, break through the ice, and scrub with a mix of ash and lye until your knuckles bleed, and your soul leaves your body. Rinse, freeze, repeat. Cooking is a game of improvisation and lowered expectations. You stir the same pot you used yesterday. You skim the surface for mold and add more water, maybe some herbs, maybe a pebble for texture. You serve it hot and call it soup. Afternoons are for fixing things, tools, fences, relationships strained by arguments over who ate the last turnip. You sharpen blades with a whetstone that's older than your grandfather, who, incidentally, died falling off the same ladder you now use to patch the ceiling. Children help, in theory. Mostly they get underfoot, but even toddlers are handed tasks. Holding yarn, scaring crows, carrying small bundles of kindling. They work because they have to. Playtime is what happens when they finish early, and no one ever finishes early. Inside, the spinning wheel turns endlessly. Wool doesn't spin itself. Linen doesn't weave itself. Every thread in every tunic has passed through hands that ache. Gloves are a luxury. Calluses are standard issue. And if you drop a spindle and it rolls into the fire, you just stare for a moment and quietly consider walking into the flames after it. By late afternoon, it's already dim. The sun barely tries in winter. Shadows stretch long. You rush to finish the day's tasks before the light fails. You patch walls with mud, rehang door hinges, fix a leaking roof with nothing but straw, a rock, and wildly misplaced optimism. Then you prep for the evening. Stir the stew, stoke the fire, scrape the frost off the inside of your water bucket. You change into warmer clothes, which are the exact same clothes, but with one more layer of sadness. Dinner arrives, such as it is. A bit of stew, some bread, a communal mug of weak ale or water that's been boiled 3 times, just to make it less deadly. You sit near the hearth, not too close, sparks, not too far, frostbite. You eat fast, the warmth fades quickly. Afterward, there's no winding down. You're still spinning thread, mending socks, patching cloaks, scraping soot. Children sleep near the fire in a tangle of limbs and snoring. Adults stay up, not for leisure, but because the fire needs tending and tomorrow's firewood needs hauling. If you're lucky, there's a song. Someone sings softly while spinning or shelling peas. It's not joyful, but it is comfort, a reminder that life still exists outside the labor, just barely. Night falls early. You lie down in the same clothes, under the same damp blanket, on the same straw mattress. You listen to the wind rattle the shutters. You hear the goat fart in its sleep. You hope the roof holds. You hope tomorrow is warmer, or at least not worse. You fall asleep mid-thought, not because you're calm, but because exhaustion is the only lullaby you can afford. Of course, this is just one day. Tomorrow, you do it all again. Every chore repeats, every moment aches. There's no such thing as catching up, only falling behind more slowly. Holidays are rare and misleading. A day off might mean attending church in the cold, standing for hours, while a priest reminds you that suffering is good for the soul. Then you return home and catch up on the chores you couldn't do because of all that spiritual enrichment. The rhythm of winter life is monotony with stakes. You don't do chores to feel productive. You do them because not doing them means someone doesn't eat, doesn't warm up, doesn't make it through February. The margin for error is microscopic. A torn cloak, a lost hat, a broken tool, all potential disasters. Every task, no matter how small, hums with quiet urgency. And still, you keep going because you must. Because no one else is going to haul that water, mend that wool, feed that goat, or boil that gray, slightly suspicious stew. This is your life. This is your winter. And the chore never ends. Sometimes you wonder what it would be like to rest, truly rest, to sit, to breathe, to not have a list in your head that stretches from dawn to dusk. But rest is a luxury, movement is survival. So you shift the logs, fold the wool, quiet the baby, nod to your spouse across the hearth. Another day done, another set just like it to come. The work doesn't stop, but neither do you. Even in sleep, your body aches with memory. The blisters, the burns, the bruises. They don't heal. They just become part of you. Like the smoke in your clothes, like the frost on the windowsill, like the life you never chose, but live anyway. You don't choose to get sick in the Middle Ages. You just wake up one morning and realize your nose won't stop running. Your throat feels like you gargled pine cones, and someone seems to be inflating your joints from the inside. Congratulations, you're now fighting off something that doesn't have a name, a cure, or even polite bedside manner. You're not sure if it's a cold, the flu, or medieval tuberculosis, but it's yours now. Getting sick in the winter is almost a rite of passage. The hut is damp, the air is cold, the fire went out during the night, and you've been breathing in smoke, goat dander, and spores from the wall moss since October. No one knows what germs are yet, but your body does, and it's currently throwing a tantrum about it. Everyone coughs, everyone sneezes, no one covers their mouth because nobody has tissues, and personal hygiene is just a rumor. The children are all sick, the old people are sick, the livestock might be sick. You're holding on, barely, by drinking boiled nettle tea and hoping the smell alone doesn't finish you off. The remedies? Oh, you're going to love them. There's bleeding, of course. That's the go-to for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Someone shows up with a dull knife or a friendly neighborhood leech and decides the solution to your fever is less blood. Does it work? Absolutely not. Does it make you lightheaded enough to forget your symptoms for a while? Yes, actually. Then there's the herbal tea. Mixtures of whatever dried weeds the village healer found before the snow came. Yarrow, wormwood, nettle, maybe a handful of unidentified moss, and a generous pinch of superstition. You boil it in a cracked clay pot, strain it through your sleeve, and sip it slowly while trying to ignore the fact that it tastes like bitter mud and betrayal. Of course, you might also be advised to fast, because clearly what a body fighting off infection needs is less food. Bread is already hard to come by. Pottage has turned to gray sludge. Fasting for spiritual purification is just code for rationing when the pantry looks like a haunted pantry. Other cures include steam inhalation from the same pot you just boiled your soup in. Prayer, the longer, the better, and in extreme cases, applying hot coals near the skin to draw out the poison. which works about as well as it sounds. Medical help, such as it is, depends entirely on who shows up first. If it's the village healer, you might get a poultice and some herbs. If it's the priest, expect prayers, holy water, and a gentle reminder that maybe you brought this on yourself by skipping mass. And if it's the barber surgeon, well, start writing your will. The barber surgeon arrives with a sack of instruments that haven't seen soap since the last plague. He's cheerfully optimistic, you less so. He looks at your swollen leg and mutters something about humors, then pulls out a saw and a tankard of ale. Don't be silly. You'll bite on a stick and scream into the void like everyone else. Sometimes they'll prescribe purging, either up or down, depending on which end is more offended by your condition. Laxatives made from boiled bark or dried beetles, emetics brewed from wine and sadness. You're not just sick anymore. You're violently sick, aggressively sick, the kind of sick that leaves you questioning your commitment to staying alive. Still, some people do recover. You lie in your straw bed for days, sweating through wool, alternating between shivering and hallucinating. The fire is low. The hut is dark. The air smells like damp wool and whatever herbal nightmare you drank earlier. And somehow you pull through. But not everyone is so lucky. Illness spreads fast in a small, sealed box filled with smoke, livestock, and zero ventilation. You cough. Your child coughs. Your neighbor coughs through the wall. Within a few days, half the village is sniffling, wheezing, or laid out flat under moldy blankets, being fed onion water and last rites in equal measure. No one knows what's causing it, so naturally, people guess. Maybe it's bad air, maybe it's a curse, maybe old Maud gave someone a funny look in church last week, and now the whole street's coughing blood. Superstition mixes with desperation until you're hanging herbs over doorways, burning dried sage, and sleeping with iron under the bed to ward off evil spirits. It doesn't work, but at least it smells nicer than the goat. The worst part is, you can't stop working. You're sick, but the firewood still needs chopping, the cow still needs milking, your kids still expect dinner, even if it's just a steaming bowl of hope and nettles. Rest is a luxury reserved for corpses, so you stagger out of bed, wrap yourself in every piece of wool you own, and shuffle through the snow like a disgruntled ghost. And all the while, the risk looms that this won't just be a cold, that it's the start of something darker. Typhoid, pneumonia, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself, just takes you quietly in the night. That's the real fear, not the pain, but the silence that follows. If the sickness gets worse, the signs are clear. The fever spikes, your breath rattles, you stop getting out of bed. Someone lays a cloth over your forehead and pretends it's helping, and the priest is summoned. Not the healer, not the barber, just the man in robes who says it's time to prepare your soul. Confession comes quickly. You mumble out every sin you can remember, even ones you probably didn't commit, just to cover your bases. The priest nods solemnly and sprinkles you with holy water that smells faintly of mildew and desperation. He says words in Latin. You don't understand them, but they sound final. Your family gathers. No one says it, but they're preparing. The pot of herbs simmers quietly. Bread is saved. A blanket is tucked in a little tighter. There's a moment, just one, where you lock eyes with your spouse and realize neither of you is sure which of you will survive this winter. But sometimes, mercifully, the fever breaks. One morning, you wake up, and the fire is still burning. Your breath doesn't catch. Your fingers can move. The room still smells like death warmed over, but at least it's warm. You've made it barely. And now comes the long road back to functional. Recovery, however, is not glamorous. Your legs are weak. Your back aches. You haven't eaten solid food in days. And even if you had some, your stomach's not convinced it wants it. You get up too fast and nearly faint into the fire. Your first trip outside feels like crossing a frozen tundra on legs made of disappointment. No one throws a celebration. You just pick up where you left off. There's kindling to split, cloaks to mend, and a suspiciously bloated pig to investigate. If your voice still cracks from the infection, too bad. If you lost a few pounds, well, silver lining, less strain on your shoes. And just because you survived this one doesn't mean you're done. Illness never really leaves. It waits in the corner, in the wind, in the shared mug, or the unwashed cloth. You live in a world where health is a passing visitor, not a resident. Still, you carry on, because there's no other option. You cough less. You breathe a little easier. You no longer see strange shapes in the corner of the room. The color returns to your face, along with the weight of everything that still needs doing. Because in the Middle Ages, illness comes free, but survival, that's extra. You don't brag about surviving. You don't even talk about it. You just wake up the next day, pull on your patched tunic, and start hauling water again. Because in this world, staying alive is the only proof you ever get that you were strong enough. And even that, in a winter like this, feels like a small kind of miracle. Truly, authority in medieval Europe wasn't a suggestion. It was a fact of life, like mud, cold, and that one neighbor who always smells like pickled turnips. And in the dead of winter, when hunger thinned patience and tempers ran short, obedience wasn't just expected, it was enforced. You don't talk back. You don't complain. You don't ask why, unless you enjoy the taste of public punishment and splinters. From the lord of the manor to the local priest, everyone above you in the hierarchy expects immediate compliance, and they've got a belt, a staff, or a scripture ready to remind you. Start with the manor lord. He owns the land, technically. You don't even rent it. You just live there like a tolerated parasite. You farm his fields, pay your dues, and bow when he rides past, even if your back's already broken. If he says jump, you ask how high, then jump anyway, just in case he meant it metaphorically. Refuse? That's cute. Let's see how funny that is when he finds you, takes your grain, or throws you in the stocks during a snowstorm. The stocks, by the way, are winter's least cozy seating arrangement. Wooden planks clamp your arms and neck while your neighbors get to walk by and admire your poor life choices. It's cold, it's humiliating, and if someone's feeling festive, they might throw something. Turnips if they're nice, rocks if they're not. You don't protest. That might get you a second round. But lords weren't your only problem. The church was just as powerful, and arguably more terrifying. God might forgive, but the local priest? Not so much. He watches everything. Who misses Mass? Who works on holy days? Who might be secretly coveting someone else's goat? And he keeps a record, not just for spiritual purposes, but for leverage. One misplaced comment, and suddenly you're accused of blasphemy or witchcraft, or worse, forgetting to tithe. Speaking of tithes, they're not optional. You give 1/10 of everything you produce, even if that means you don't have enough left for yourself. Grain, eggs, chickens, your dignity. The church takes its share. And if you fall short, you don't get a reminder notice. You get a sermon delivered in front of everyone, complete with meaningful stares and eternal consequences. The priest's power isn't in muscle, it's in memory. He remembers who skipped prayers, who whispered during Mass, who dared to question why Lent means eating boiled weeds for 6 weeks. And in the winter, when everyone's cranky and coughing, it doesn't take much to land yourself in the pulpit's line of fire. Then there's the law, or whatever passes for it. The constable is often just a farmer with a stick and a vague sense of authority. Laws are less about justice and more about keeping people in line. Steal bread? Lose a hand. Say something cheeky to a noble? Lose a tongue. Gossip too loudly? Get fitted for a scold's bridle, a lovely little iron mask with a mouthpiece designed to make you think twice before speaking a third time. Even private matters come with public consequences. If your child misbehaves, you're blamed. If your spouse curses, you both suffer. Discipline is a community affair. The whipping post doesn't care whose idea it was, just that someone gets hit. And don't get too clever. Intelligence in this world is suspicious. Reading is for priests. Curiosity is for troublemakers. If you ask too many questions, someone might accuse you of sorcery, which comes with a complimentary drowning or bonfire. If you're a woman, the rules are even stricter. You obey your father, then your husband, then your son, in that order. You speak softly, work constantly, and never give anyone a reason to point at you and whisper which, because once that word is in the air, it doesn't matter what you've done. Healing someone, knowing how herbs work, talking back, with extra kindling. And let's not forget your fellow villagers. They're not just bystanders. They're part of a system. That neighbor who smiled at you during market might report you for working on a saint's feast day. That cousin who borrows your firewood might also casually mention you muttered something unholy in your sleep. Surveillance isn't digital, it's human and deeply nosy. It's a culture of control. Everyone watches everyone else, and nobody is safe. The cold only sharpens the paranoia. Long nights breed longer grudges. One small slight, a stolen tool, a bad trade, a missing hen, can escalate into accusations, punishment, and public shame. And there's no appeal process. The closest thing to justice is hoping your Lord is in a good mood, and your priest didn't stub his toe on the altar steps that morning. Even jokes are dangerous. Say the wrong thing in the wrong tone near the wrong person, and suddenly your sense of humor is considered evidence of sedition. Laughter is fine if it's at the Lord's joke, at the priest's sermon, or at someone currently in the stocks. Anything else is suspicious. Winter makes everything worse. People are hungrier, colder, and meaner. Punishments hit harder when your skin's already chapped and your spirit's already cracked. A slap in summer is an inconvenience. In winter, it's a deep sting that doesn't fade for days. And with no ointments, you're left to treat your bruises with snow and silence. There's no village meeting to discuss grievances. There's just top-down orders and bottom-up obedience. And if you push back, if you speak your mind, advocate for fairness, or question why Father Thomas gets extra rations every Friday, well, you're courting a punishment that might outlive your usefulness to the village. Even animals get better treatment if they're productive. A healthy ox is more valuable than an injured peasant. A goat that gives milk gets fed before you do. Your worth is measured in output and obedience, not opinion. Stay in your place. Stay quiet. Stay useful. That's the unspoken motto, and winter only underlines it in frost. And yet, people adapt. They learn to bow without bending too far. They master the art of polite silence. They say yes with their mouth, and not today with their eyes. Obedience becomes a skill, part survival tactic, part social performance. Children learn early. They're taught not just how to work, but how to act, how to speak to the Lord, how to avoid the priest's gaze, how to sit still at Mass and not giggle when old Margaret snores during the homily. You don't teach them to dream big. You teach them to stay small, unnoticed, and intact. Even religion, the supposed comfort in a world this hard, is used as a leash. You're reminded weekly, sometimes daily, that obedience brings salvation, that questioning is the road to hell, that God is watching, and also, coincidentally, so is Father Thomas, who seems a little too invested in whether or not you kneel deeply enough during prayer. At night, the village is quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that sits heavy. You listen to the fire crackle, the wind moan, and the occasional footsteps of someone trudging home from the tavern. You lie still, wrapped in wool and fear, and think about how obedience kept you alive today. Not happy, not free, but alive. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and obey again, not because you believe in the system, but because survival depends on it. The price of winter is submission, and everyone pays, whether they mean to or not. You don't question the cold. You don't question the rules. You just pull on your boots, bow your head, and keep moving. Because in the medieval winter, questioning authority isn't rebellious, it's suicidal. Even your thoughts aren't entirely your own. You shape them carefully. Keep them quiet. Tuck them away behind your eyes. Because in a world built on obedience, even thinking freely feels like a dangerous luxury. So you obey. You endure, and you wait for spring. Because in winter, even rebellion freezes. You're not alone out here, and that's not meant in the comforting sense. The kind people say when offering a hug. It's the kind whispered by your inner voice when something howls in the woods and your door isn't quite shut right. Because in the medieval winter, you are surrounded by things that want your food, your warmth, and occasionally your face. Wolves are the obvious concern. By December, they're starving. By January, they're bold. They prowl the edges of the forest, closer now than in summer, noses lifted toward your chimney smoke. They smell meat. They smell fear. They smell you. And when you walk alone, maybe to fetch firewood, maybe to empty the slop bucket, they watch. Sometimes they follow. They rarely attack outright, but you've heard stories. Everyone has. Some say they wait until you slip, until your lantern goes out, until your boot catches the snowdrift and you fall face first in silence. Then it's over fast, or not fast at all. But wolves aren't the only ones watching. There are smaller predators, quieter, sneakier, and often already inside. Rats don't care about the cold. They've made themselves at home, tucked behind sacks of barley, scurrying under your straw beds, nibbling anything remotely edible and some things that aren't. You've heard them at night, the gnawing, the skittering, the occasional scream from someone discovering a rat had made a nest in the laundry pile. They eat grain, soap leather. They chew through your shoes, your belts, the bindings of the only book in town. If it can be chewed, it will be. And when food runs low, truly low, rats become more than pests. They become a test of what you're willing to kill in the name of dinner. Cats help when you've got them. But a good mouser in winter is almost worth more than a child, and they know it. They lord over the cottage like tiny monarchs, demanding warmth and respect in exchange for thinning the vermin herd. If they don't feel like hunting, well, too bad. The rats resume their midnight buffet, and you wake up to something missing, a corner of bread, a rind of cheese. Then there are the dogs, not all of them friendly. Some are village strays, half-wild things with torn ears and ribs showing through their fur. Most were abandoned when food got tight. Now they roam in loose packs, sniffing at doors, chasing chickens, and occasionally cornering someone too slow to close the gate. You don't trust them. They don't trust you. They bark at ghosts and sometimes at nothing at all. But when they're hungry enough, barking turns into biting. Out in the woods, you've heard rumors of lynxes, rare, but not impossible. A blur of fur and claws that disappears before you're even sure it was real. Mostly they avoid people. Mostly. But if one showed up in the village, no one would be surprised, just unlucky. Boars are worse, big, mean, and stupid. They don't hunt you. They charge you, especially if they're cornered or desperate. You've heard of men losing legs to a wild boar tusk, or lives in the leanest months. Some still try to hunt them for meat. Sometimes they come back with dinner. Sometimes they don't come back at all. And just when you think the outside is bad, remember the inside isn't much safer. The cold drives more than rats indoors, spiders, beetles, centipedes, things that crawl and crunch underfoot, all come looking for warmth. You step on them barefoot at dawn and pretend not to scream. You sweep them into the hearth and watch them sizzle, then go back to stirring your soup like nothing happened. If you're storing food for winter, dried meat, apples, cheese, or salted fish, you guard it like treasure, not because you're greedy, but because you're in competition with everything else that breathes. The mice are relentless. The mold creeps faster than your fingers can scrape, and the family dog, if you have one, has taken to staring at the larder door like it's made of dreams. Some families hang food from the rafters to keep it safe, which works until something climbs the wall and steals it anyway. You've found half-eaten sausages on the floor, tiny bite marks in your bread, and worse, droppings in the flour bin. You wipe them out, close the lid, and pretend it's still usable, because waste is a luxury, and you can't afford either. Even birds get strange in the cold. Crows seem to follow you, perching on rooftops, watching from fence posts, silent and waiting. You tell yourself it's superstition, but then you see 3 of them on the same beam above your front door and wonder if they know something you don't. Winter sharpens everything. Sound carries further, footsteps in snow echo louder. When you hear something outside, snapping branches, low growls, even the rhythmic crunch of approaching boots, your heart doesn't race. It locks up, because sometimes it isn't an animal. Sometimes it's a person, who's just as hungry as a wolf and twice as desperate. Bandits don't take the season off. They're colder, hungrier, and more reckless. If they think your family is food, they might try the door, or break it down, which is why you sleep lightly, with a blade near the bed, dull, rusted, but sharp enough to give you a fighting chance. You pray you never have to use it. And so, every noise becomes a question. Every gust of wind, every creak in the roof, every bump against the wall. Is it just the cold settling in, or something trying to get in? You start to learn the language of winter, the way snow falls when something has moved through it, the silence that means something's watching. You listen differently. You think differently. You begin to count your food in days, not weight. You tuck your hands under your arms whenever you're not working, not because it's warm, but because frostbite doesn't ask permission. And you never, ever let your guard down, because predators don't knock, they don't announce themselves, they just arrive, teeth bared, claws out, cold as the season itself. The church might preach that God watches over you, even in winter, but God doesn't patrol your chicken coop. He doesn't chase rats out of the cellar, and he doesn't leave tracks in the snow just beyond your door. So you check the locks, you double knot the rope, you leave the fire burning low and the knife where you can reach it. And when you sleep, it's the kind that ends at the smallest sound, half rest, half readiness. In the mornings, you check for tracks, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. A single line of paw prints across your garden means something visited, maybe just passing through, maybe scouting. Sometimes it's foxes nosing around the chicken coop, sometimes it's worse. You shovel snow from the path, not just to walk safely, but to erase evidence, to make your home look less tempting to whatever might be watching from the tree-line. Some people hang charms above their doors, bits of bone, carved wood, sprigs of dried herbs. Protection, they say, against animals, against spirits, against luck turning sour. Whether they work is anyone's guess, but no one dares remove them. Your dreams turn strange, teeth, eyes, heavy footsteps. You wake in a sweat, breath fogging in the cold air, and listen, just in case. Because winter in the medieval world doesn't just test your strength, it tests your sanity. It frays your nerves, your sleep, your sense of safety. Every dark night is a dare, every howl a reminder. Out here, you're not at the top of the food chain. You're just another creature trying to survive the cold. So you carry on, eyes open, doors shut tight, because in a medieval winter, staying warm is only half the battle. The rest is making sure nothing eats you before spring. And if something is hungry enough, it won't care whether you've prayed, prepared sass, or hidden well. It will just come, and you'll need to be ready. Because in a world like this, even rebellion freezes. When your food is gone, your toes are numb, and your roof leaks more than it covers, there's only one place left to turn: God, or more specifically, the medieval church, which, depending on the day, is either your salvation or one more mouth demanding something from you. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't optional, it was oxygen. It filled every hour, every room, every thought, especially in winter, when death felt closer than ever and plagues liked to show up uninvited. You didn't just believe in God. You structured your life around the idea that he was watching, and that he wasn't thrilled. The church building itself was no haven. Stone walls, dirt floors, a draft that seemed to aim directly at your spine. You'd huddle beside your neighbors, trying not to shiver loud enough to be accused of weakness, while the priest, layered in robes and spiritual authority, droned Latin none of you understood. But you nodded anyway, because it wasn't about comprehension. It was about obedience. Mass didn't pause for weather. If the river froze over, you crossed it. If your child had a cough that sounded like the devil himself had taken up residence in their lungs, you wrapped them up and brought them along. Missing Mass wasn't just frowned upon. It was noted by the priest, by your neighbors, by that one old woman who never blinked and always sat in the front pew. And let's not forget tithing. 10% of everything you had, or were supposed to have, went to the church. Not 10% of your surplus, 10% of everything. Whether your family was living on turnip broth and stringy boiled oats, didn't matter. The Lord still needed his cut. Apparently, heaven had expenses. During winter, religion wasn't just ritual, it was survival theater. People prayed for everything: warmth, food, health, the strength not to strangle their in-laws after 3 months of being snowed in. Every problem had a saint. Sick cow, St. Eligius; frozen fingers, St. Polycarp, probably. Lost your axe in the river, St. Anthony. Lost your mind trying to survive January, St. Dymphna, patron saint of those just barely holding it together. And then there were relics, bones, teeth, splinters of alleged crosses, handkerchiefs that once touched someone holy. These were housed in glass cases, silver boxes, or whatever could be fashioned out of melted-down spoons. People would trudge through snow and slush for miles just to glimpse one, kiss it, and whisper a prayer, not because they fully understood the theology, but because they were out of options. Miracles, at least in theory, were always possible. You could be healed. Your baby could recover. Your pig might stop foaming at the mouth. And if none of that happened, well, perhaps it was your fault for not believing hard enough. Or for that unconfessed sin you were pretending didn't count because it happened in the dark. Confession was its own sort of winter ritual. You'd kneel in a wooden booth, knees frozen, voice low, whispering your sins to a man who already suspected what you were going to say. The priest didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, always had. Adultery, theft, envy. That time you accidentally ate bacon on a fast day. You said your piece, got your penance, and left the booth feeling briefly lighter, until the guilt crept back in 5 minutes later. And then came fasting, Advent, Lent, Saint days. No meat, no eggs, sometimes no dairy. In the middle of winter, when you already hadn't tasted meat in a month, and your last egg froze solid before you could crack it, you'd huddle over your sad little stew, made from whatever hadn't molded yet, and call it holy sacrifice. But you didn't dare question it. The church was everywhere. It owned land. It controlled calendars. It collected dues. And it told you, explicitly, that everything you endured in this life would be worth it if you followed rules. And if you didn't, eternal fire, not metaphorical fire, actual burning, shrieking forever fire. That's what waited for you if you slipped up. The weather itself was a sermon, a sudden storm, God's warning, a stretch of mild days, God's mercy, a frozen crop, someone sinned, who unclear, but someone. This turned villages into moral pressure cookers. Neighbors watched neighbors, the widow who muttered too loudly during Mass, the man who skipped Vespers, the child who asked too many questions. Any of them could be the reason the goats froze. The line between spiritual and social punishment blurred quickly. Gossip spread like frost across a field. You'd hear whispers, "She doesn't kneel properly," or "I saw him work on the Sabbath." The next thing you knew, you were at the center of a prayer circle or an accusation. And while you were freezing your extremities off trying to be a good person, the priest lived just a little warmer. Not wealthy by noble standards, but definitely better off than you. He had wine, actual wine, a private chamber, possibly a feather pillow. And he reminded you often that your suffering was part of God's plan, which was convenient for him, less so for you. But you still listen, because what else was there? Hope, no matter how dim, was the product the church traded best. In a world where your child could die from a cough, and your neighbor could vanish beneath a collapsing roof, heaven offered a kind of cruel comfort. If this life was nothing but mud, hunger, and cold, then surely the next would be better. Golden streets, warm light, no frostbite, no rats. You held on to that vision, not because it made sense, but because it had to. Because otherwise, you were just surviving for the sake of suffering, and that was too much for anyone to admit out loud. You'd carve little crosses into the beams above your bed, whisper rosaries in the dark, tie charms to your belts, saints for safety, saints for sleep, saints for not dying before morning. Every tiny ritual was rebellion against despair. You couldn't fix the cold, you couldn't fix the hunger, but maybe you could stay in God's good graces long enough to see spring. And that meant keeping the faith, even if your knees bled from kneeling, even if your prayers went unanswered, even if, deep down, you weren't sure anyone was listening. And when someone did die, which in winter was often, it was the church that guided their body to rest, or tried to. The ground was frozen. Graves had to be hacked open with picks or left shallow and marked for later. The priest would mutter Latin over a frost-covered shroud, incense freezing mid-swing as the living buried the dead with red fingers and numb faces. Sometimes the body couldn't even be moved. A makeshift service might be held in a barn or right there in the house, as family members huddled beside the wrapped form, praying it wouldn't attract wolves before morning. But the church had answers for that too. Death was a passage, a test. The cold couldn't follow you into heaven. The hunger would end. The pain was temporary, if you believed and if you obeyed. So even in the worst moments, kneeling in a church so cold your breath fogs the hymnal, confessing sins just to feel some control, praying to a saint you barely remember the name of, you kept going. Because faith in the medieval winter wasn't just about salvation, it was about survival. And when the cold howled loudest, it wasn't the fire or the food that kept people going. It was the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. Because in a world ruled by frost and famine, belief was the last thing that couldn't be taken. There's a lie people like to believe about winter, that it ends in March, that spring arrives like clockwork, just when it's needed most. Flowers blooming, birds returning, the sun stretching its golden fingers across thawing fields. But in the Middle Ages, winter didn't care about calendars. It came when it wanted, left when it was finished, and sometimes it didn't leave at all. March could be just as cruel as January. Snow still fell, ice still clung to the eaves like it had paid rent, the wind kept howling, and the sun stayed low, pale, and deeply unhelpful. Mud replaced snow, but that didn't mean life got easier. It just meant your boots got heavier. Spring was a rumor. Hope was a dangerous luxury. By the time the snow finally melted, the damage had already been done. The ground thawed, yes, but the people didn't. What winter didn't freeze, it starved. What it didn't starve, it broke bones, tools, spirits. Some families came through it thinner, some didn't come through at all. You'd walk into town in April and find doors still shut, chimneys still cold, no smoke, no footprints, just silence. That particular kind of stillness that means someone didn't make it. Maybe it was the old man whose cough never got better. Maybe it was the woman who gave her bread to her children until there wasn't enough left for herself. Maybe it was the child who got sick in February and just faded. Funerals were quiet affairs, if they happened at all. By late winter, the graveyard had filled faster than anyone expected. The earth was too hard to dig properly for most of the season, so bodies were sometimes wrapped and kept in barns or caves until the ground could be broken. You'd smell them before you saw them. And even if you survived, you didn't exactly celebrate. You didn't burst into song at the sight of a crocus. You stared at the dirt like it owed you something, like maybe if you waited long enough, it would give something back, food, hope, a reason. Spring was not a joyful rebirth. It was a slow, muddy crawl out of the grave you nearly slipped into. You were alive, yes, but different, a little quieter, a little thinner. You laughed less, you trusted less. You had seen what hunger could do, what cold could steal, what desperation could turn people into. You didn't talk about it, not directly, but you saw it in each other, in the way people flinched at loud noises, hoarded crumbs, stared too long at piles of firewood as if counting them like coins. You could tell who had seen someone die. You could tell who had buried their own. And the hunger didn't end just because winter did. Your stores were empty, your livestock thin. Nothing had grown yet. It would be weeks, months even, before the fields fed you again. Until then, it was the waiting game. You boiled the same roots. You baked the same rock-hard bread. You hoped the rains came and not another frost. And then there was the work. Winter didn't just starve you. It broke your tools, rotted your thatch, collapsed your sheds. Spring meant fixing everything, fences, roofs, wheels, muscles. You had to patch, plant, chop, haul. There were no breaks, just new tasks stacked on top of the old ones. You planted seeds with fingers still cracked from frost. You hoed soil while coughing up the tail end of a January illness. You did all this while pretending you weren't still hungry, weren't still grieving, weren't still having dreams about being chased barefoot through snow by something with your brother's face. Records from the time, where they exist, speak more in silence than statistics. Parish logs list who was buried, but not why. Chroniclers write of harsh seasons, of unusual mortalities. They don't mention that a village of 60 might be 40 by April, that 10-year-olds look 20, that women miscarried from cold alone. What we know is this. Medieval winter wasn't something you got through. It was something you survived, in the strictest sense. You made it to the other side, not untouched, not whole, just breathing. And even that was rare. No one talked about trauma. The word didn't exist, but the symptoms did. In every hollow stare, every child who flinched at the wind, every man who woke up shouting in the middle of the night, you were expected to move on, to rebuild, to be hey there, tonight we're going back, not to castles and kings, but to the edges of history, the part that doesn't make it into paintings. We're talking about medieval peasants, the ones who didn't ride horses or wear crowns, who survived plagues, hunger, cold, and 100 small indignities, all without a title to their name. No glory, no legacy, just long days, short nights, and a quiet kind of strength most of us wouldn't last a day in. If this kind of calm, slow history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same quiet story. So dim the lights, turn on a fan if you like that soft background hum, settle in, and let's begin. At the edge of the map, this village doesn't have a name, or if it did, no one remembers it. It sits in a shallow valley, somewhere in the vague middle of nowhere, a soft crease in the land, just distant enough to avoid roads, records, or royal attention. You wouldn't find it on a map if you had a map, which you don't. You've never even seen one. Here, the world ends where the trees begin. The forest is thick and slow-moving, like something ancient that's only barely tolerating your presence. The fields stretch outward in irregular patches of green and brown, worked until exhaustion, then work some more. Somewhere to the north is a river. You've never seen it, but you've heard it mentioned in the same tone one might speak of dragons or saints. This is where you were born and where you'll die, maybe 60 steps from one to the other. The homes are rough and slumped, as if the wind has pushed against them too many winters in a row. The walls are wattle and daub, that is mud, straw, and sticks, carefully woven together and patched endlessly with whatever the weather hasn't taken yet. Roofs are thatched, and they sag under their own weight, always leaking in places you can't quite reach. The village smells like wet wool, smoke, and earth, a sour edge of livestock, a trace of damp rot. None of it surprises you anymore. It's the smell of living here. The road leading in is not really a road, just a muddy track where ox carts have worn a pair of grooves deep enough to collect rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has traveled it in years, perhaps ever. Most days pass quietly. A distant bell marks the hours from a chapel in another village, if the wind carries the sound. Otherwise, you measure time by the position of the sun, or the depth of the shadows across the field, or the ache that settles into your spine before noon. There are maybe a dozen families here, enough to fill a small gathering on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's problems, and everyone politely ignores them until it's necessary not to. The village elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Tom, who once spoke to a monk and now repeats that conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one questions it. Tom's hut hasn't collapsed. His goat seems healthy. That's as close to leadership as anyone requires. Nothing here is precise. There are no written records, no deeds, no land surveys. Boundaries are understood in terms of past the old elm, or where the ground gets soft. If there's a dispute, it's handled with a shrug, a short argument, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one wants to keep fighting. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger arrives, it's discussed for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt? The arrival of someone new is both fascinating and mildly terrifying. And no one leaves, not really. The idea of travel is less a plan than a rumor. You've heard of towns, of cities, of places where stone buildings stretch 2 or even 3 stories high. But those are stories, like talking animals or women who turn into birds. You can't miss a world you've never seen. The forest is dense, the hills are long, the roads, if they exist, are known more for bandits and bad luck than any promise of arrival. What would you do, even if you reached one of those distant places? You don't speak any other dialect, you don't carry coin, you don't know the customs, you don't even know how old you are. So you stay. There's safety in the familiar, even if it's hard, even if it's dull, even if the roof leaks and the well runs low and the same stew has been bubbling in the pot for 3 days. There's comfort in routine, in knowing where the firewood is, in knowing who to ask when your fence collapses, in knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring in the sheep. You wake with the light, you sleep when it fades, you work in between. It isn't much, but it's life, and somehow, in the quiet rhythm of it all, there's a kind of peace, a kind that doesn't ask questions, that doesn't need to understand anything beyond what's visible from the top of the nearest hill. You might hear, once in a while, about a war, or a king dying, or a comet in the sky that scared a village 5 days' walk from here. But the news never seems to reach you directly. Just stories, pass through too many mouths to carry weight. They lose their urgency somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. Seasons don't shift cleanly, they bleed into each other. A damp spring becomes a wet summer. A hard frost turns into the kind of winter that chews through your boots. You don't count years, you count harvests, dry ones, wet ones. The bad one when the rye grew black with rot. The good one where the barley came in thick and heavy, and even old Marjorie smiled for a week. His steward does come by. He collects grain, asks questions, writes things down. You answer carefully, never with too much detail. He doesn't seem to like detail. You've never met the king. You're not entirely sure what he does, but you know his name, and you say it when you pray, just in case it matters. Because here, on the edge of the map, most things don't change, and when they do, it's usually for the worse. Still, the half glows. The roof mostly holds, the cottage is warm, and tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills, and for now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but almost all of them will be in circles. Most people in the medieval countryside never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, not because they lacked curiosity or energy or boots, though boots were often a luxury, but because the world beyond the next hill didn't really belong to them, and the idea of going to find it felt as far-fetched as flying. You grew up learning the names of every patch of land between your home and the edge of the field. You knew the shape of every tree stump on the path to the well. You could tell who had walked the road by the depth of their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that started to feel theoretical. The next village over might only be 5 miles away, but it may as well have been a foreign country. You'd heard stories about it. Who married who stole a goat, who said the priest snored during Mass. But you hadn't seen it, and you likely wouldn't, because travel was dangerous. Not in the fun, thrilling way, but in the quiet, exhausting, possibly fatal kind of way. Roads weren't well-kept paths lined with signs and travelers' inns. They were mostly muddy tracks through forests, fields, and long stretches of very empty, very silent land. No maps, no directions, just vague advice like, go until you see the leaning pine tree, then left past the stone that looks like a sleeping pig. And on those paths, there were things to worry about. First, the forest. Medieval forests weren't parks. They weren't romantic. They were dense, dark, tangled with roots, and filled with noises you couldn't always identify. Boars, wolves, people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't born into the woods, they didn't want you in them. Second, bandits, people with nothing to lose and no land to till. Travelers were vulnerable, especially if they looked even vaguely well-fed. A man walking with purpose might be assumed to have coin. A woman might be traveling alone because she had something worth stealing. You learned quickly that confidence wasn't armor. Third, getting lost. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. If you wandered off track, there was no one coming to find you. You couldn't follow a river downstream and hope for the best. You could go days without seeing another soul. Your body could disappear into the bracken like smoke. People wouldn't know you were missing until the next feast day, when someone finally asked about you, and someone else just shrugged. Then there were the practical concerns. If you traveled too far, who would tend your field? Who would feed the animals? What if the Lord Steward came by to collect a tax while you were gone? You couldn't explain absence to a man holding a ledger. Your duties didn't pause just because you were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did make it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders brought problems, disease, crime, strange ideas. You spoke a slightly different dialect, used different phrases, maybe even held your spoon differently. You could be met with suspicion, or worse. Hospitality wasn't universal. Food was scarce, and beds were already full. The safest place was home, not because it was particularly safe, but because it was familiar. You knew which part of the roof leaked, which chickens wandered too far, which neighbor might lend you a tool without asking too many questions. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel sometimes, not peasants, usually, but merchants, monks, messengers, people with protection or a purpose or both. You might see them once or twice a year, coming through with carts full of wool or salted fish, trailing stories, behind them like campfire smoke. They spoke of cities where buildings were made of stone and shops sold spices, and people walked streets that didn't turn to soup every time it rained. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dream too hard, because even if it were true, what would you do in a place like that? You couldn't read. You didn't own coin. You wouldn't know which customs were expected. The city could swallow you whole, and no one would even know your name. So you stayed, not because you were afraid, though sometimes you were, but because you had things to tend, a fence to mend, a niece to watch over, a bit of barley to dry, and a dozen other tasks that all needed doing before the sun dipped below the tree line. And because, truthfully, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had gossip and conflict and weather and sickness and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells and the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes, you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the woods, but most days, you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate or the reckless, sometimes the ambitious. A young man might set out in search of work or adventure or a cause worth dying for. He might come back with a limp or a story, or not at all. And when he didn't return, no one said much, just shook their heads and said he went beyond the trees, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also known. You weren't lonely exactly. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in the familiar complaints. You didn't need to see a distant city to understand the value of warmth, or taste cinnamon to know the joy of sweet bread, or cross a kingdom to feel love, or sorrow, or boredom, or hope. And as the years wore on and the aches settled deeper into your joints and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the idea of travel faded, not with regret, but with understanding. Some people were meant to move. You were meant to stay. There's no blueprint, no architect, no pile of neatly labeled lumber waiting to be assembled. Just mud and wood and whatever else the landscape hasn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house, not in the way most people think of one. It's more like a compromise between shelter and weather, between effort and decay, between what you needed and what the land reluctantly agreed to give you. You begin with a frame, rough-hewn timbers from the nearest trees, cut with tools that have passed through more hands than you can count. The wood isn't straight. It bends a little, it warps, but you don't mind, neither are your walls. Once the frame is up, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts, a process called wattle. It's not elegant. It's not even particularly quick, but it holds together, for the most part, like the rest of your life. Then comes the daub, a mix of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slap it on by hand. You press it between the gaps. You smooth it just enough to keep the wind out and pretend it's deliberate. It dries slowly, cracking in the sun, occasionally falling off in clumps that need to be redone before winter. You get used to the smell eventually. You stop noticing it. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw packed tightly together and tied to the beams. When it's fresh, it's golden, almost pretty. Then the rains come. Then the birds come. Then time comes. The color fades, the edges fray. Holes appear where you never expected them, and you start placing buckets in places you hoped you'd never have to. You don't shingle it. You don't waterproof it. You just keep patching it until the whole thing threatens to become more patch than roof. At some point, you wonder if it might be easier to live under a cart. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's packed firm, and it is. Sort of. Years of walking, sweeping, spilling, and stomping have turned it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When the goats come in for the night, it's anyone's guess what's actually underfoot. You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helps a little, but soon the straw gets damp, gets dirty, gets walked into dust. Then you sweep it out and start over, or you don't. Eventually, the straw becomes the floor, and you accept it as part of the landscape. Windows, technically, openings in a wall anyway, are covered with wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close flush. Glass is too expensive, too rare, too fragile. So the wind comes in, the cold comes in, the sounds of the animals outside come in, and sometimes the animals themselves. There's a single door, usually hung a little crooked because the frame shifted during the last frost. It latches with a hook or a wooden peg, not for security. There's nothing to steal, but to keep the chickens from wandering out and the wind from wandering in. Inside, the layout is best described as shared. One room, maybe two if someone managed to tack on a lean-to or a loft, but usually just one, where you sleep, eat, cook, mend, talk, argue, and hope. Everyone lives here, parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe a neighbor's child whose parents are sick or gone or both. There's a hearth in the center, built of stone if you're lucky, clay if you're not. The smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, always a little warm, a little damp, and always carrying the quiet scent of stew that's been reheated one too many times. Furniture is limited. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, a chest if someone in your family was unusually good at carving or very lucky in marriage. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, often shared, usually squeaking. Blankets are wool, heavy, rough, never quite dry. There's storage in the rafters, garlic, onions, herbs, maybe a small ham if the pig was kind that year. You can smell the difference between early winter and late spring just by the air above your head. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes it's a reminder of how close you are to running out. Animals are part of the household, literally. The cow might sleep in the same room, off in the corner. Chickens, too. A goat. It isn't ideal. It isn't sanitary, but it's warm. You learn to tune out the clucks and the shuffles and the occasional startled bleat in the middle of the night. They're part of the background noise, like wind in the thatch or the slow, settling creak of the walls. Nothing is level. The floor dips, the roof slants, the walls bulge slightly, like the whole place is breathing in and out with the seasons. You fix what you can. You ignore what you can't. Every spring, you swear you'll repair the back wall. Every autumn, it's still leaning. It's not a house built to last. It's a house built to get through the next storm. And yet, for all its flaws, and there are many, it's home. You know where the cold comes in and how to block it with an old sack. You know which roof beam you can hang the pot from and which one creaks when someone stands too close. You know how the light falls through the slats in the afternoon and where the dog curls up to sleep. When strangers pass through, they see poverty. You see effort, reuse, resourcefulness. A roof that hasn't yet collapsed is a victory. A fire that still burns at dawn is a blessing. A dry corner is worth more than gold. And when you lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by snores and silence and smoke and straw, you feel a strange kind of comfort. Not pride, exactly, but presence. This is your space. It bends, it leaks, it shifts in the wind, but it's held, and so have you. For the average medieval peasant, food was not an experience. It wasn't colorful or diverse or even all that warm. It was closer to a daily problem that had to be solved again and again, using the same pieces and the same tired hope that something edible might come of it. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was a corner of your single-room home near the hearth. There was no pantry, no shelves lined with ingredients, no carefully hung herbs in a sunny window. There was just a pot, a fire, and short list of things you hoped hadn't spoiled. At the center of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew that lived in the pot and never fully stopped cooking. It was never entirely new and never entirely gone. You added to it during the day. You skimmed it at night. You kept it warm through the seasons and prayed nothing strange grew in it when your back was turned. The ingredients depended on what you had, which usually wasn't much. On a good day, pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and a few legumes, maybe garlic or onions if the harvest had been kind. If it was winter, you used dried beans or peas. If you were especially lucky, a scrap of salted pork might get tossed in. More often, it was just a bone. Even that was valuable. You could boil a single bone for days, hoping it would remember what meat tasted like. The flavor profile was consistent, earthy, gray, more temperature than taste. You didn't eat pottage for the joy of it. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm meal at the end of the day was more than comfort. It was a small victory. The pot itself never really got clean. It was wiped down, sometimes scraped, but rarely scrubbed. The next batch always absorbed the ghosts of the last one. There was no spice to cover it, no vinegar to brighten it, just a slow, dependable dullness, a taste like boiled history. Bread was the other major player, not soft or golden or inviting, but hard, dense, and dark. It was usually made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the soft white kind, was for the upper classes. Peasants could barely afford to see it, let alone bake with it. The loaves were small and heavy. They didn't rise much. They crumbled quickly. If you left them out for a day, they could probably double as a weapon, but they filled the stomach and gave you something to soak in your stew. Sometimes the bread was made from questionable flours, chaff, ground-up peas, or whatever was left at the bottom of the miller's barrel. In hard times, people used bark, not metaphorically. They literally ground up the inner layer of tree bark and mixed it with what little flour they had. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, and barely digestible. It kept you alive, technically. On days when even flour was scarce, people used trenchers, slices of old bread used as plates. These soaked up stew and were either eaten at the end of the meal or thrown to the animals. Sometimes they were passed down the table to someone of lower status. Bread hierarchy at its finest. Protein was rare, very rare. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. You didn't eat your livestock unless you had no other choice. When you did, you used every part. Meat, fat, organs, bones. The blood was used for puddings. The fat was rendered. The head might become soup. Nothing was wasted. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat flavored many dishes, often turning something barely edible into something vaguely pleasant. But pigs were slaughtered only when necessary. A whole pig meant weeks of planning, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was an option if you lived near water, but even that came with restrictions. Many rivers and lakes were controlled by lords, and fishing without permission could earn you a fine or worse. When you did fish, it was for eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't immediately rot. Salted herring, if you could get it, was a prize. The church dictated a fair bit of your diet, too. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, so you pivoted to fish or went without. In more creative times, beaver tails were classified as fish, a theological workaround that few questioned because it meant having something to eat. Milk was common but also fragile. You had to use it quickly or turn it into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury in some homes, used sparingly. Cheese was harder, tangier, and often quite dry. If you had a few good rounds stored away, it meant the cow had been generous that year. Dairy, though useful, didn't always agree with people, and refrigeration didn't exist. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter went rancid. Cheese molded. You just cut around the worst bits and hoped your stomach was stronger than the bacteria. Drinks were simple. Water was unreliable, often unsafe to drink, depending on the season and what upstream neighbor had been careless. So ale was the default. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed in homes and drunk by everyone, including children. It had low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and dull the edges of thirst. If you had access to apples or pears, you might make cider. Wine was for the clergy and nobility. Mead was rare. Milk was for the young and the sick. Otherwise, it was ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to help forget that tomorrow would taste exactly like today. Vegetables formed the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, carrots, though not the orange ones we know now. Medieval carrots were white or purple. Most were grown in small gardens, tended carefully, and eaten root to leaf. Nothing was wasted. The tops of turnips might be boiled into greens. The skins were composted or tossed into the fire. Fruit was seasonal, apples mostly, maybe some berries or wild plums. If you dried them, they lasted through winter. Otherwise, they were eaten fast. Preserving was difficult. Sugar was nearly impossible to afford. Honey, if you had bees, was a treasured sweetener. Otherwise, your pottage stayed savory, in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs were grown when possible: parsley, sage, dill, mint. They weren't used for flavor so much as medicine or tradition. Some herbs were thought to protect against illness. Others kept pests away. Occasionally, they even made things taste a little better. But that was a happy accident, not the goal. Meals were eaten together, on benches, around the fire. There were no courses, no recipes, just a pot, a hunk of bread, and the hope that there would still be something left tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the stew thicker. If you had a feast, a wedding, a harvest festival, a saint's day, you might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not the flaky, buttery kind. A medieval pie was more like a sealed box made of hard dough to hold a meat filling, often heavily spiced if spices were available, which they usually weren't. You might flavor it with pepper, ginger, or cinnamon if someone had traded well. Most days weren't feast days. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl, you soaked your bread, you drank your ale, and you leaned back, full enough to get through the evening, if not exactly satisfied. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing what the pot would taste like, in knowing how much bread was left, in watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire as the wind whispered through the cracks in the wall and the animals shifted in their sleep. The stew boiled, the bread cooled, and you, once again, had enough. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. You might have a patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, a crooked house you built with your own hands. But none of it, technically, was yours. It all belonged to the Lord, not a king, not someone mythical or distant, just your local landholder, the one who lived up the hill in a slightly less crooked house, with slightly better food, and a roof that probably didn't leak. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a sense, you. You were what was called a villain. That's not an insult, it's a category. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass it on freely. You owed labor, goods, and deference. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't built on conversation. It was built on obligation. You didn't talk to him. You talked to the steward, the man who managed his lands and, more importantly, kept track of what everyone owed. And you owed a lot. Let's start with labor. A few days a week, sometimes more during harvest, you were expected to work the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was called corvée labor. You got nothing for it, no payment, no thanks, just a knowledge that somewhere in the manor house, someone ate because of what you did. You also owed taxes, and they came in many shapes. A portion of your grain, a share of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. If you had a pig, you owed bacon. If you managed to catch fish, guess who owned the river? The taxes didn't end with food. If you used the mill, you paid a fee. Even though the mill was the only way to grind your grain, even though the Lord owned the mill and set the price. You might be tempted to grind it by hand, but doing so was often illegal, punishable by fine or worse, because the Lord didn't just want his share. He wanted control. Same with the oven. Many manors had a communal oven, one you paid to use. If you tried baking at home and the steward found out, there could be consequences. You learned to do things the official way, even if it took longer, cost more, and made less sense. And then there were the fees. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's plot? There's a fee. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission, then, you guessed it, pay a fee. Your livestock? Taxed. Your tools? Sometimes taxed. Your ability to breathe without permission? Barely untaxed. And what did you get in return? Well, the Lord was supposed to protect you, in theory. If bandits attacked, or if a rival noble invaded, the Lord had men-at-arms who could fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores, though rarely for free. And if you had a legal dispute, say, your neighbor's goat wandered into your garden and refused to leave, the Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in the language of loyalty and protection. In practice, it was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor itself stood apart from the village, sometimes literally on higher ground. It might be made of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's home, with a roof thatched so thick no wind dared enter. Inside were tapestries, tables, servants, And the Lord, of course, wearing wool lined with fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine, and thinking very little about you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers. How much barley you owed this year, how many eggs you'd promised, whether your son had reached the age where he could be added to the labor rolls. Everything was recorded, not by you. You couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with wax tablets or bits of parchment who came around with questions you learned to answer carefully. And if you didn't meet your obligations, there were punishments. Fines, usually, more goods taken, days added to your labor. In extreme cases, your tools could be confiscated, or your land reclaimed, or your house, your goats, your dignity, all of it gone. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion, it was foolishness. But here's the strange part. The system worked, not because it was fair, but because it was stable. It had rules, predictable, if harsh. You knew what you owed. You knew what was expected. There was no guessing, no sudden surprises, just a steady, grinding rhythm of give, 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 and occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord would give something back. A feast day where food was distributed, a holiday where labor was waived, a kind word, perhaps, spoken from horseback. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to keep things from tipping. The relationship was never friendly, but it was enduring. Your Lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or distant, but he was always above you. You didn't question that. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right words, not because he deserved it, but because you didn't want trouble. And maybe, deep down, because a small part of you still hoped that one day you might be noticed, rewarded, lifted, even just a little. It almost never happened, but that's how the system stayed alive. Not just with fear, but with the faintest suggestion of hope. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking, the reeve kept writing, the mill kept grinding, and you kept digging your hands into the soil, year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no bonus, no upward mobility, only the quiet knowledge that you had fulfilled your role. You had done what was asked. You had made it through another year under the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to go on living. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe and etched itself into history books, medieval peasants were already well acquainted with sickness, not the kind of illness that came and went with the seasons, though there was plenty of that too, but the slow, constant presence of something always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't an event, it was a feature of life. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be laid low. All it took was a small cut, a single flea, a bit of water that looked clear but wasn't. And unlike weather or taxes, illness didn't follow rules. It arrived without warning, and it rarely left quietly. There were no hospitals, not really. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman, maybe a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to boil and which ones to burn. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, well-meaning, and slightly more effective than random prayer. But for the most part, when you got sick, you stayed home, you lay in bed, you sweated through your shirt, and you hoped. Most people didn't understand what caused disease. The word germ hadn't been invented yet. Microscopes were centuries away. What you had were theories, old ones, confusing ones, and often wrong ones. Some believed in miasma, bad air that carried disease through smell. If a village reeked of rot, manure, and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous, which, in a way, was correct, but not for the reasons people thought. To combat the bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers in their sleeves, or walked around with vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, not helpful, but deeply believed. Others blamed divine punishment. Illness came from sin, from impure thoughts, disobedient acts, or general moral decay. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your crops failed, and then your body failed, it was probably your fault, or your neighbor's, or both. There were local traditions, too. Some thought illness came from an evil eye, a glare from someone jealous or angry. Others blamed moon phases, animal spirits, or grumpy saints. One particularly popular explanation was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The solution? Boil them. And if that didn't work, burn something nearby, possibly your mattress. The cures were as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A local man would arrive with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than training. Sometimes leeches were used, sometimes sharp stones. The idea was to balance your humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If they were out of sync, so were you. No one ever saw these humors, of course, but they were blamed for nearly everything. For swelling, there were poultices, smears of mashed herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the body. Some worked, most didn't. A few made things worse, but the important thing was that something was being done. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your eyes blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. If your leg turned black, you were probably out of options. And then there were the plague amulets, bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with protective words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes, others hung garlic above the door. One popular remedy was to tie a live chicken to the infected area and hope the illness transferred to the bird. It rarely did, but hope was in short supply, and people clung to whatever they could. Sickness was isolating, but not in the way we think of now. You didn't quarantine. You didn't call for help. You just tried to work until you couldn't. When that moment came, you laid down, and others carried on. Children were fed. Animals were fed. You were given broth, maybe, and a few murmured prayers. Sometimes illness passed. The fever broke. The swelling went down. You walked again slowly, with a new limp and a deeper respect for warm soup. Other times, it didn't, and your family lit a candle. Plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic kind that left bodies in carts. More often, it was a slow infection, skin turning dark, limbs swelling, a cough deep enough to rattle the walls. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even the flu could sweep through a village and leave half the population in bed. There were no case numbers, no charts, just stories. A traveler from another village said the cough had started there last week, or someone heard that 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You started boiling more water. You left herbs under the door. You kept your distance, even if no one said why. Death was not always feared, but it was recognized. People knew when it was near. They knew the signs: breathing that slowed, skin that cooled, eyes that turned dull. There were prayers for the dying, soft ones, whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally did arrive in the 14th century, it hit with a violence that dwarfed everything before it. But by then, the world was already familiar with sickness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night was not new. It was just happening more often. The plague came in waves, and each time, it returned stronger, stranger. Buboes swelling in the neck and groin, fever that stole the mind, blood that darkened and bubbled. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages vanished. Fields went untilled. Bells rang too often. Some peasants tried to flee, but disease travels faster than feet. Others turned to religion, doubling their prayers, whipping their backs, promising to live better if they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, blaming sinners, blaming anyone but the wind. The church offered explanations and comfort and burial. Monks died in droves, priests vanished. In some places, death became so common that the funerals were skipped. Bodies were buried in mass graves, often without names. And yet, life continued. People learned how to survive around sickness. They accepted it the way they accepted hunger or cold, not joyfully, but with a kind of tired resilience. They cleaned their homes more often. They shared herbs. They whispered new prayers. Some believed that surviving one sickness gave them protection against the next. Others didn't believe at all, but they got up anyway and milked the cow. Children grew up learning which plants to avoid, which ones to chew, and which ones to boil until they stopped smelling like feet. They knew how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever, how to tell when someone wasn't going to get better and when you should stop hoping. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married, they harvested, They shared meals, such as they were. They sat by the fire and retold stories of the last illness and the time someone's grandfather survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and stubbornness. Plague wasn't the end of the world. It was just another part of it. And for those who endured, survival became its own kind of resistance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to go quietly. A belief that tomorrow would come, and if it didn't, someone else would remember your name, or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was silent in the way a cave is silent, full of creaks, distant sounds, and the kind of quiet that makes you notice how loudly your own body exists. The day ended when the light failed, and everything that wasn't already put away had to be dealt with quickly because, once darkness fell, the world shrank to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light, no candles burning freely into the night. Wax was too valuable. If you had a tallow lamp, it was reserved for emergencies or religious devotions. Most nights, the fire dimmed, the coals glowed softly, and that was all. And so you slept, but not in the way we think of sleep, not in a single, unbroken stretch. Sleep in the Middle Ages came in 2 acts. First sleep, then a waking period, and finally a second sleep. This rhythm wasn't accidental. It was how people adapted to the long, lightless hours between dusk and dawn. You would drift into your first sleep, not long after nightfall. The fire would be banked, the animals would have quieted, children would be hushed, the home, one room, maybe 2, would stretch out into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was stuffed with straw or feathers, possibly lumpy, often shared. If you didn't, you slept on woven rushes or directly on the earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together, family, relatives, even servants, all in one shared space, not out of closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, even animals were brought inside. A goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth was more important than boundaries. There was no privacy. The idea of sleeping alone was associated with punishment, not comfort. The rich might afford solitude. Everyone else just made do. You turned to face the wall. You stuffed straw in your ears. You shared blankets. You breathed in each other's breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you got used to it. First sleep lasted a few hours. Then, almost like clockwork, people would wake. It wasn't disturbing, it was expected. During this time, the world was still and quiet. Some people prayed, others stirred the coals, some used the chamber pot, or stepped outside into the freezing air. Some reflected, others whispered. It was a time of dreams, too vivid ones. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the mundane. If you dreamed during this waking interval, you remembered it, and you talked about it the next morning, not in passing, but as something that mattered. Eventually, the second sleep began, deeper, slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. It was when the aches faded slightly, when the day's blisters cooled. If you were lucky, it was uninterrupted. If you weren't, you simply lay still and waited for dawn to give you an excuse to rise. The home didn't go silent at night, not entirely. The fire crackled, wind whispered through the thatch. A baby might fuss, a cow might shuffle its hooves. Sometimes the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end. And everyone noticed, but no one said anything. It was understood. The fear of the dark was real and not irrational. The night carried real dangers, both imagined and entirely physical. Wolves, for instance, in some regions, their howls came close enough to the village to raise hairs on the back of your neck. They weren't just creatures of legend, they were real and hungry. Then there were thieves, rogues, strangers, fires that started from a careless coal, roofs that groaned under snow, and less explainable things, ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't talk about them openly, but you knew they were out there. To protect the household, you followed rituals. You placed iron by the door, made the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispered protective blessings over the straw mattress, hung herbs, rosemary, sage, rue above entryways. Sometimes, you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with protection, Some families believed that sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So people tucked in carefully, covered mirrors, faced the bed toward the fire, avoided sleeping with their feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy. It seeped through walls, through thatch, through poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under mounds of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, tunics. The idea of undressing for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in your clothes, sometimes in your boots. There was a comfort to sleeping next to others, but also discomfort. Someone always shifted, someone always murmured. There were elbows, knees, the occasional surprise from the family dog. But this was normal. You didn't expect silence. You expected closeness. And in that closeness, you found a strange kind of security. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother mutter a prayer in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human. It was shared. When you dreamed, your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake illness. A broken tooth could mean death. You learned to interpret these things. Or you found someone who could. The village had dream readers, not officially, but everyone knew who to ask. The church had its own ideas. It warned that some dreams were from the devil, that sleep was a time when temptation could slip in. You were told to pray before bed, to avoid certain thoughts, to keep your soul ready in case the night was your last, because it could be. People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold while you rested. A fever could rise. A cough could deepen. And by morning, someone might be gone, quietly, as if stolen. This uncertainty gave every morning a slightly reverent tone. When the light returned and the rooster cried out and the coals were stirred back to life, it meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose. You wiped your face. You looked around and counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Everyone who didn't was checked on. And then, once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water was fetched. Bread was prepared. Animals were fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared. And the memory of the night faded, not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour. Second sleep, a world without clocks, but not without routine. And for all its discomfort, there was something grounding in that rhythm, something honest. You didn't aim for comfort. You aimed for endurance. And if you happened to find rest along the way, a moment of warmth, a particularly quiet night, a dream that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift, one you didn't question, one you didn't expect to gain too soon. Some years, you're simply hungry. Other years, you're in a famine. It's not the same. Hunger is manageable. It has rules. You stretch food. You ration. You hope. But famine breaks the rules. It's when the fields fail, the root cellar is bare, and there's no more pretending that next week will be better. It's when food becomes an idea more than a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring. Too much rain or none. The barley came up patchy. The beans flowered then browned. The cabbages cracked open too early. The wheat heads stayed stunted, bowed like they were already mourning something. You noticed. Everyone did. At first, no one said it. But the looks were exchanged, the calculations made quietly, internally. How much is left from last year? How much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat? The answers were never good. The hardest part was knowing what to do next. Not in winter, but in summer, because that's when you had to choose between planting the seeds or grinding them into flour, between saving for a harvest that might never come or feeding your child one more bowl of something warm. And so the portions began to shrink. The stew got thinner, the bread got smaller, the bowls didn't come back empty. They just came back less often. You didn't panic, not yet. You told yourself this happened once before, or that another village might have extra, or that the manor stores could fill in the gaps. Hope was still on the table, just not much else. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens were quiet. The goat's bleating grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, like it understood it was next. Bread became ritual, one loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up things you didn't recognize and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night. Not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't ask for honey. They didn't beg for stories. They sat close to the fire and stared. They learned how to wait. And your neighbors, you stopped seeing them outside. The village quieted. No more laughter in the lane. No more arguments about sheep. Just the occasional cough or crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them silent. Sometimes, someone would bring back a rabbit or a bird or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and ground. You chewed them, even when they still tasted bitter. You smiled anyway, not because it tasted good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manner. Sometimes they gave grain. Sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. That was good and bad. Good because he wasn't there to take anything. Bad because he wasn't there to help either. His silence said more than words ever could. The church did what it could. Bread after Mass. Alms for the poorest. But they, too, were stretched. You prayed more. Not out of faith, but out of repetition. Words are easy when your hands are too tired to do anything else. Some left the village entirely. Packed up and wandered to find work or food or God. Some returned, some didn't. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. The body changes in famine. You feel your ribs first, not from the outside, but from within, like they're too close to your skin. You stand up slower. You bruise easier. You wake up with your hands clenched, like they're still gripping tools you can't afford to use anymore. And the cold hurts more. The fire is your best friend. You spend more time tending it than you ever did cooking on it. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed it, even as your belly goes empty, because heat is the one luxury you can still provide. By now, you've eaten everything that could be eaten. The roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You've boiled bones 3 times over. You've soaked bark. You've baked famine bread that cracked your tooth. And when the food was gone, you looked to the things that weren't food but might become food in the right light. Leather, boiled and salted, not delicious, not satisfying, but technically chewable. You found a rat once. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you hid it, cooked it alone, told no one. You still feel guilty, but you don't regret it. The dreams become strange. You dream of feasts, tables full of roast and bread and wine. You wake up chewing your tongue. You dream of boiling things over and over, even though you haven't boiled anything in 3 days. You dream of animals coming back, of green shoots breaking through snow. You dream of your childhood, when hunger was simpler. And some nights, you dream of being full. You wake from those crying. The graveyard grew slowly at first, then quickly, then too quickly to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to lift the rope. The grave was shallow, the prayer was short, the mourning was silent. Everyone had their own hunger to manage. You wanted to mourn, but you couldn't afford the emotion. You held it back, like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended, not suddenly, but steadily. Rain came, and it stayed. The ground softened, seeds germinated, plants reached up, weak but real. You had enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others, children first, elders next. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it. And when the first good loaf came out of the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before you ate. You remembered every day you went without, every trick you used, every lie you told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time, it filled you. By the time you could walk, the church had already marked you. It had taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with Latin you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that extended far beyond your village. You belonged to the church, not because you chose to, but because there wasn't another option. In the quiet corners of your life, those dim early mornings before the fire had caught, Those wet nights when the wind howled through the shutters, you felt its presence like gravity. It didn't just exist beside your life. It organized it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, and defined what came after it. The church wasn't a place you visited. It was the air around you, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year. It was the voice that murmured over your grave and the one that whispered about it decades before you got there. The village priest, often the only person who could read, was not just your confessor. He was also your calendar, your counselor, and the nearest thing to an oracle you had. He held the mysteries of the sky and the stories of the saints and knew why a pig might die or a storm might come. He walked through the village like a man carrying both blessing and thread in his robes. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, marriage, and death, free of the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved, because love, you were told, required obedience. Latin was the language of the Mass, and it might as well have been a spell. You stood in the church beside your family, feet numb from cold, listening to words that never belonged to you. You didn't know what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something invisible had happened, that the bread wasn't bread, that the wine wasn't wine, that the murmuring of words and gestures could move the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you anyway. You mouthed along where you could. You crossed yourself when the others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness like someone learns the path to a well, without understanding every step, only that you needed it. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told you what you could eat, when you could eat it, and how guilty you should feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Friday fish, even if you lived nowhere near water. Almond milk for the wealthy. Turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saint days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. But even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer. It was also for payment. The church collected 1/10 of your yield, no matter the season: grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion. That's what you were told. But God didn't collect it. The priest did, or the steward with his ledgers and his silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, which was always bigger than your home. You saw your neighbor's hand over their last sack of oats, while the priest prayed for mercy they had just paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains came too late or the frost too early, the demand didn't change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labor. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back, even when you stood upright. But the church didn't just take. It gave, too, though not always in the way you wanted. It gave stories. It gave structure. It gave reasons. When your cow died without cause, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he told you it might be a test or a punishment or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle or visit a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a scrap of relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for plowing, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told in flickering firelight by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread or fasting or a pilgrimage if only they'd help you this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave for a few days. You stepped outside the same 5 miles you'd lived your entire life, You walked roads you didn't know, toward shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived, footsore and raw, stood before a bone or a statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned, not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual, choreographed by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered, the candles were lit. The bell might ring if someone had the strength. You were buried on sacred ground, beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death, there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years or centuries or longer, unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through. And so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared, because fear, too, was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort, always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power, not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all, and a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when the indulgent seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or you acted like you did, which, in the end, was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand Aladdin, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, and the candles would burn, and your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints still listened. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church, in all its weight and mystery and dust and gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after everything they endured, after the famines and plagues, after the tithes and taxes, and the heavy boot of the manor's authority, peasants would have risen up more often, that the weight of centuries of suffering would have built up until it cracked the walls of their villages, until one cold morning the frost would thaw, and something inside them would snap. You might think they would have gathered in fields and marketplaces, tools in hand and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't, not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were revolts, yes. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France a few decades earlier, small uprisings scattered across Europe like stones thrown into a still pond, angry voices in places where the lords had taken too much, pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught. A tax collector's house burned, a steward run out of town, a banner lifted. But those fires burned fast and were snuffed out even faster. They ended in executions, in gallows built in village squares, in silence heavier than the one that came before. The world didn't change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more, you have to stop thinking of them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors, not of single tragedies, but of unbroken hardship, sustained year after year. They lived in a world of low ceilings, where hope was something rationed like grain. They didn't lack courage. They lacked margin. In a life where every day was spent just trying to keep the roof patched and the soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion. You could plan a revolt, Or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth was, the system worked, not because it was just or kind or efficient, but because it was ancient. It had sunk its roots into the habits of generations. It didn't need to be explained. It simply was. You owed labor. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth, and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when the reeve passed your door. You were born into that owing, and unless you were exceptionally lucky, you died in it too. But by staying within those bounds, you could survive. Barely, yes, but you could. The cost of stepping outside those rules was too high. The manor had soldiers. The church had excommunication. The king had no idea you existed, but he had laws that still bound you like rope. The penalty for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse: banishment, starvation. Your family left to carry the debt you tried to escape. Everyone had heard a story. A father taken, a mother whipped, a cousin who disappeared after refusing to pay. The stories were passed down, not to stir rebellion, but to prevent it. Besides, rebellion often didn't feel like an option because the people you lived beside were not strangers. They were your kin, your neighbors. You shared fields, tools, fences, and prayers. Even if you hated the steward, you might still marry his daughter. Even if you resented the tithe, you still brought bread to Mass. The village wasn't a place you could leave easily, nor was it one you could tear apart without tearing yourself apart in the process. To revolt against the manor was, in some small way, to revolt against the rhythms of your own life. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine the peasant as a figure of eternal submission, head bowed, hat in hand. But this picture misses the complexity of their world. Submission wasn't servitude, it was negotiation. Most peasants did not simply suffer. They adapted, they bartered, they bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes in the spaces between the rules. A pig kept off the ledger, an extra sack of rye buried in the earth, a bribe given in eggs rather than coin. These were the rebellions they could afford. They were practical people. Their world was not governed by ideology, but by weather. The question was not what is just, but will this feed us through winter? And justice, if it ever came, was a luxury they didn't trust. The church played its part, too, and perhaps more effectively than the sword. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You were taught that your trials were not punishment, but purification, that your obedience would be rewarded, not in this life, but in the next. And if the promise of heaven wasn't enough, the threat of hell filled in the rest: fire, torment, gnashing of teeth, all waiting for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who said no. And yet, the peasants were not passive. Their resistance was just quieter. They gossiped about the stewards. They sang rude songs about the Lord's habits. They laughed when the priest stumbled on a sermon. They told stories at night of better days and better men. They found dignity in the smallest acts: a shared crust, a well-timed silence, a field tended just a little differently than the rule book said. Their rebellion was in the way they survived despite it all, not because they accepted the system, but because they made it bend just enough to let them breathe. Sometimes, of course, things changed. A lord died, and his son was kinder. A new bishop forgave debts. A terrible storm reminded the powerful that even they were mortal. But those changes came from above. The peasant's job was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, and to teach their children to be quiet when they had to be and brave when they could be. And there were dreams. Of course there were. You might not have called it revolution, but you thought about a different life. You dreamed of a day when your child wouldn't have to carry the same burdens, when no one would knock on your door with a list of dues, when your back wouldn't ache before 30, when you could sleep without worrying about wolves or soldiers or winter. Those dreams kept you going, but they lived beside reality. You didn't expect them to come true. You just needed them to stay alive. What's perhaps most astonishing is not that peasants revolted so rarely, but that they managed to keep their culture, their faith, their families intact, despite the weight of the system pressing down on them. They kept songs alive that no one wrote down. They passed stories from one hearth to the next. They remembered which plants healed and which ones didn't. They taught one another how to pray, how to birth children, how to bury the dead. They created a continuity that outlasted kings and crusades. And they did it not with banners or battles, but with persistence. Persistence was their rebellion. When the manner demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned against them, they huddled close and waited for spring. The fields may have belonged to someone else, but the soil still remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them the way it would in later centuries, in the speeches of radicals or the slogans of crowds. But there was a different kind of strength in the way they endured. To live a life of hardship without letting it harden you completely was its own kind of defiance. To kneel, not because you were weak, but because you knew you could rise again tomorrow, that too was a form of resistance. And so they endured quietly, without monuments or songs written in their names. They endured in the rhythm of the plow, in the smoke rising from cottages at dusk, in the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured in stories whispered to children who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them or folds them into a footnote beneath kings and conquests. But the peasants were the thread that held the tapestry together. Without them, there would have been no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies to march under banners. They built the world, even as they were kept from owning it. They may not have overturned their lords, but they outlasted them. And maybe that is revolution enough.